So this is based on an ebook that I wrote toward the end of last year called Why You Need Penetration Testing. For a lot of security professionals, this can be a difficult question to answer. The most common answer to this question is, well, we have a compliance effort or a certification or something that is demanding that we do penetration testing. So that's why we need penetration testing, which is valid. That's a common case. We understand that. But that's a second order purpose. That's not really a first order purpose. And so what I want to talk about today are first order purposes. So that's why the subtitle of this presentation is nice to have turned need to have. And I'll talk about what I mean here in a minute. Agenda for today. So we're going to talk about the bottom line up front. If for some reason you can only join this for about 5 minutes, I hope that you walk away with everything on the next slide. So I will give you as much as I possibly can in the next slide. But for those of you who can stick around, we'll talk about knowing where you stand. So when it comes to your security baseline, your maturity level, understanding where you are relative to best practices, perhaps companies or organizations like yours, getting an idea, a realistic idea of what you look like to attackers. We'll talk about how the hack is sometimes coming from inside the house, which is a section on insider threats. We'll talk about what insider threats are, and we'll talk about more so insider threats as actual human beings in the context of pressures and maybe drivers that are typically on insider threats to do the kinds of things that they do. We'll talk about telling a story of resilience. So how you can communicate penetration testing results to customers, to a board of directors, to executives in ways that are productive. They're not overly negative. They don't make people look bad. They're used for growth, how they should be used. We'll talk about how attackers select targets, which, small spoiler, it's pretty much anybody. There really is not a lot of selection going on these days, at least that we've seen. And then we'll talk about the path forward. So what can you do going forward? What can you do with the information in this webinar? How do you get started on penetration testing if it's not something that you've ever done before? Or how do you maybe upgrade your penetration testing efforts to maybe a more sophisticated team with more sophisticated techniques behind them, or maybe to even something a little more mature? So bottom line up front, you 5-minute people, here's what I want you to walk away with. First, head in the sand approaches to the threat of adversaries have lengthened the list of easy targets for ransomware gangs. So what I mean is the more we remain ambivalent or oblivious, especially on purpose, the more people, the larger pool attackers will have to go after. Second thing, the consequences of not being prepared for a successful attack are growing more costly. And I don't just mean financially. I mean that reputation and trust with customers, with business partners, with vendors, all of that is at stake now. The third thing, despite its glamorous look, despite its reputation as an edgy exercise, a lot of pen testing is not really tied to what sophisticated attackers are doing. There are common processes in pen testing that most good firms will follow, but pen testing is not quite what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the whole message of this webinar is that penetration testing isn't optional anymore. It's actually your starting point. So I'll get into what I mean. So knowing where you stand, we'll talk about using penetration testing as a baseline measurement. So I mentioned that not a lot of people know how to answer the question, do you do pen testing? If you do pen testing, how do you do it? What have you learned from it? Where does that put you? A lot of people don't know what their foundation is. So they don't really have an idea of what they can stand on. Plenty of organizations are running without the essentials. So I always say that there are 3 absolutely critical components of a security program for any organization. An asset inventory, which is to say you have to know what you have and what you don't have. A network diagram, you have to know how all the things you have talk to each other and interact with each other. And then you have to have a threat model, which is an understanding of how somebody is going to look at the things you have and how they interact with each other and how they might go about attacking it. Threat models consist of other things. There are business threats, there are environmental threats like natural disasters, but I'm primarily talking about attackers. The lowest common denominator is not getting the basics right. So we find more often than not that when we are successful in penetration testing or red teaming or some other advanced exercise, most of the reason we're so successful is because it's the core fundamentals that organizations are missing. Things like network segmentation, things like access control, basic access control. So a thorough penetration test that actually considers a threat model, remember that model of how an organization is most likely going to be attacked, will actually reveal where best practices are not being followed. So I have the benefit of working with a bunch of GRC experts, and all of us have the benefit of utilizing Phalanx, which is our GRC platform. By conducting audits constantly and conducting penetration tests constantly, we're able to understand trends in different environments, completely disparate organizations, but we can identify things that are going on. So some core gaps revealed by penetration testing pretty commonly. Vulnerability management is not something that we see a lot. Simultaneously patching programs that would normally be part of a vulnerability management program are either non-existent, or if they do exist, they're not enforced or they are not monitored very well. Endpoint security and hardening is something that we don't see a lot. And then we get into stuff like asset inventory. So we're talking about secure network design. How are all of your assets not impacting the security of other assets, hopefully. Active Directory misconfigurations. So not just vulnerabilities with Windows or with a web server, but actual issues with the way that users and endpoints are provisioned in a traditional network, oftentimes through Active Directory. Detection and response measures are also a common gap, and then I already mentioned access control quite a lot. What I will say is that there is maybe nothing that ruins a pen tester's day quite like getting the fundamentals right. But those are often the things that we find are the least mature. A lot of times, the basics will be done not as well in place of maybe a product or a service being laid over the top of it that is selling security. It's selling a message of monitoring and maybe AI-based threat protection and that sort of thing. But if the fundamentals underneath are not up to snuff, if they're not where they should be, then that product is not going to help nearly as much as it's being sold as. So like I said, we've had the benefit of seeing a lot of environments. I've pen tested and audited more environments than I could possibly count over the last 5 years. And what we've been able to do, especially using Phalanx, is look at all of the control gaps we've ever identified, over 1,000 audits. And there's some things that we've identified. We identified a lot of metrics. I pulled from a separate white paper that we have, the ones that I thought were most relevant to this. I think we could probably send out a link to the other information after this, but this is what I think is most important for our purposes. The first thing, 77% of environments we looked at had gaps related to asset management. That's over 3/4 of organizations have no idea or very little idea what assets they actually have and are responsible for. 40% of environments were not doing proper patching and vulnerability management. So never mind 0 days or vulnerabilities that came out recently, 40% of environments were not ready for vulnerabilities that maybe came out 2, 3, 4 years ago. And 73% of environments didn't sufficiently harden and monitor endpoints. So even if an organization has well-established vulnerability management practices, and maybe they understand where all of their assets are, there's a good chance that those assets are not hardened and they're not monitored. So maybe they're not as vulnerable as other assets, but they're not hardened against more sophisticated attack types. And if an attack succeeds that the organization is not prepared for, there's no way of knowing that actually happened because there's no monitoring in place. So the hack is coming from inside the house. Insider threats are here to stay. So before we can talk about insider threats in any productive way, we have to define what an insider threat actually is. And this is going to sound simple at first, but I promise there's more to this. So an insider threat is, simply put, a threat that involves anyone already inside. Now, what I most commonly hear is that insider threats are acting maliciously, when this is actually not true. So Proofpoint did a study back in 2022 called the Cost of Insider Threats Global Report. that found that just over half of insider threat related incidents were actually just the result of negligence. Only 18% were related to credential theft. What this means is that most people who constitute an insider threat are not acting maliciously. If anything, they are being tricked, maybe they're being coerced. They're not just deciding one day that they want to ruin the organization or get revenge for some internal politic thing and selling credentials to a ransomware gang. This is mostly just the result of negligence. So we have to know what we're trying to account for. There's certainly malicious intent in some cases, but if we're only focusing on that, we're focusing on the minority of insider threat reasons. So only 26%, there you go. It's not a small figure at all, that's a quarter, right? But only 26% actually resulted from malice. So if detections and processes are in place to present malicious insider threats, but they're not considering the components that matter in the case of a negligent insider threat, then it's an incomplete prevention system. Additionally, Proofpoint found that the increase in time required to contain an incident resulting from an insider threat is actually up. So between 2021 and 2022, it went from 77 days to 85 days. That's almost 3 months that a breach as the result of an insider threat can exist in the network before it's being contained. That's a long time. So ransomware is a competitor. So what happens when ransomware groups can give people financial freedom in uncertain economic times? I actually wrote this at the end of last year. I would argue that economic times are maybe a little bit more uncertain now than even they were at the end of last year. And when economic times are uncertain, people get desperate. Because again, we're talking about insider threats, but these are human beings. So they're wondering if they're going to lose their job because there's a headline every other day about layoffs. And not just at any old company. We're seeing it at Facebook, we're seeing it at Apple, Amazon, layoffs of people just out of nowhere. People are concerned, and layoffs mean that their economic stability is in jeopardy, which means that they are worried about being able to feed their families. They're worried about being able to retire. These are things that threaten human beings' basic survival instinct. So I actually had a friend link me an article a couple days ago that suggested that cybercrime actually goes up. Cybercrime rates go up during economic recessions because people are desperate. And I thought that was interesting. And then he mentioned that Google just laid off thousands of people. There are a lot of smart people at Google, or smart people at Google. The odds of one of them or a group of them being able to perpetuate cybercrime is not low. So what happens there? Additionally, Hitachi ID published a report back in 2022 on the rise of insider threats and their attractiveness to ransomware groups. So what I'm talking about here is the likelihood or the propensity for ransomware groups to reach out to people inside organizations to do something that they want them to do. That study found that 65% of people, 65%, had been contacted by ransomware groups in the span of a month. So this is a clear marketing campaign. Ransomware groups obviously want insider threats. They've identified a valuable resource and they're going after them. Half of them were offered over $500,000 in Bitcoin or cash transfer to assist. That is not a small thing to a desperate employee in economic uncertainty. I'm bringing all of this up because testing from the inside is crucial to actually doing penetration testing that matters. Looking at the outside, scanning the perimeter, focusing just on web apps, those are all good for the scopes that they're applied to, but they don't address the threat to the organization as a whole nearly as well as focusing on people. So $500,000 is a lot to an employee, but this is really pocket change to ransomware groups in terms of what they can make back. We've all seen headlines of ransomware ransoms, the amounts being in the millions sometimes, depending on the size of the company. So $500,000, if it works, the ROI on that for a ransomware gang is pretty good. Regardless of how smart or not smart it might be for an employee to take that money, this is not, we're not dealing with rationality here. So cash transfers and Bitcoin, which is the most common one, those are both traceable. However, that may or may not deter somebody who is desperate. We've seen that this is clearly working. The plague of ransomware is only growing. So obviously this is working. Obviously the potential of being caught is not as much of a deterrent as maybe we would like it to be. And even if they do get caught, it doesn't stop companies from getting hit with the ransomware or the groups from getting their payments. So the struggle to prevent adverse impact, the battle for people not becoming insider threats is cultural just as much as it is technical. Again, these are human beings that we're talking about. Human beings just like us. We have needs and we have desires and we have fears. And when ransomware groups or anyone involved in cybercrime can prey upon that, then it puts organizations at risk. Let's talk about initial access. So we talk a lot about phishing. There are a lot of studies out there that talk about how phishing or social engineering attempts are the most common way to get initial access to an organization, and that's true. It's more nuanced and difficult than it used to be. For example, if we're talking about the 1980s and the 1990s, the threat of someone dialing into a system, kind of like the movie Hackers, was pretty big. But these days, it's not quite that simple. Firewalls and access controls on the perimeter, they make up a key layer of defense against all kinds of questionable activity. The problem is that what's too common is the lack of protective layering on the inside. For example, past the VPN authentication process, past domain logins, past even Wi-Fi boundaries, we find that networks are rarely segmented. We can jump from maybe a guest network to a corporate network. We can jump from a corporate network to a sensitive environment that's maybe processing card data, stores PHI, those kinds of extremely sensitive pieces of information. And once we're inside, we can a lot of times act with impunity, and we're not monitored very well. I find a lot of organizations using MSPs for monitoring, but all they're doing is monitoring outside activity. Once something is in, the MSP is completely blind to what's happening. This is a problem. I mean, aside from testing for password reuse or unpatched vulnerabilities, attackers aren't going to spend much time on perimeters. I would actually argue that organizations spend much more time on their perimeters than attackers do, because attackers can just focus on the people, especially when economic pressures are so useful. And regardless of how it gets in, whether it's through a 0-day in a firewall, a phishing campaign that landed in the wrong inbox, malware landing anywhere is bad news. So where the impact is measured from is the inside. We call that assumed breach. So testing from an assumed breach perspective gives you insight into how susceptible the insides of the organization are to an attacker who has already made that past that first layer. And like I just said, attackers can move around with impunity once the perimeter has been broken. I got a bit ahead of myself on this slide, but you get the gist. So telling a story of resilience. Bottom line is your customers want to know that you're taking security seriously. That is why there are markets for SOC 2 reports. That's why ISO 27001 certifications are so good to have. That's why the payment card brands established PCI standards, is so that they could ensure that there was some kind of security standard around all of this card data that's flying around everywhere all the time. Trust creates transparency. The problem is that when it comes to revealing weaknesses, which is essentially what revealing a pen test report is doing, it seems completely counterintuitive, because there are really few things that are more unnerving than allowing an attacker, like even one that you are paying from a reputable group, into an environment you've worked hard to build, hard to secure. That's really daunting. Secrecy is often incentivized. So We're talking about customers and executives. What they ultimately want is assurance. They want to know that if they're a customer, they want to know that their data, their resources are not at risk by doing business with you. Executives want to know that the organization and the people in it are not at risk based on the practices that are actually being employed within the organization, the security practices. Again, counterintuitively, you would think that revealing the weaknesses, reporting on the weaknesses, and at the same time reporting on how those weaknesses were rectified would be the desirable outcome, but oftentimes there's a bit of a skip made towards assurance where I just want to know that we're good. And this creates problems because it actually incentivizes secrecy. It incentivizes keeping results from key stakeholders because there's maybe fear or hesitation around the consequences. And the reason for that is that it would be an absolute shame if you are an organization that builds a web app, if you have a SaaS application that you sell to customers and there are vulnerabilities found in it, and you published your pen test report and some customers said, we don't want to use a SaaS application that is this full of vulnerabilities, that would be unfortunate. The problem is that the notion that there are environments without vulnerabilities could not be further from the truth. Every environment is vulnerable in some way at some point. What matters is the story that you can tell around it. That is the key to confidence, as I put at the top of this slide. Given the amount of time that vulnerabilities tend to go unfixed, it should be a competitive advantage to subject your environments to penetration testing. Constantly testing deployments or constantly testing new ways that attackers are doing things in the real world, I would hope would be a competitive advantage. Being able to tell a story about continuous testing, continuous resilience, that's a strength. In fact, communicating proactiveness is a sign of strength, not weakness. This is taking security seriously. This is making security part of the story of the organization and building it into the product lifecycle or the service lifecycle, whatever it is that is the lifeblood of the organization. If security is at the core of it, then that's a strength. That in acknowledging problems that you identify along the way doesn't mean that it is a bad application or a bad service or a bad product. It means that it is just as vulnerable as anything else in the world, but the story that you can tell around remediation is what makes it a strength. So let's talk about how attackers actually choose targets. And the truth is that attackers aren't really choosers. I've been saying for the last couple of years that there's really no such thing as an ideal target anymore. One of the most sobering realities I think that has come out of the wave of ransomware attacks over the last several years is that there is no such thing as an ideal target. And the reason for I've been saying that is that I've noticed that ransomware victims have started to transcend business sectors and industries. So initial access has become so efficient, and in some cases, honestly, so well automated that a target can't really be determined by perceived value anymore. So when we talk about ransomware victims transcending business sectors, what I mean by that is that while you will see large organizations getting hit with ransomware, I think most recently, I think there was a Massachusetts school district earlier this week that got hit with ransomware. There's a lot of information at school districts or maybe even large businesses that would be useful, but recently there was actually a t-shirt printing shop that I knew of that got ransomware, and it was a small business. It was maybe 4 or 5 people, but they had cash register systems that were connected to the internet, and those register systems were ransomware. And because of that, they couldn't do any transactions, they couldn't ship any orders, and they started to lose money. And the actual ransom was only about $30,000 or $40,000, which is a lot of money, but not nearly as high as the ransoms for big companies where the amounts are in the millions. That's because the ransom itself was scaled down to what the cybercrime group actually thought that the t-shirt printing business could pay. And so it had nothing to do with wanting sensitive t-shirt data or competitive advantages in the printing process. It was not about that. What it was actually about is that they had data and they didn't want to lose it. They had access to computers that were core to the business functions, and they didn't want to lose them, and they didn't realize that until they had. So it doesn't matter if you're dealing with sensitive government data. There aren't grandmaster plans, or at least not very often that I know of, to steal classified schematics for anything when it comes to how to make money as a cyber criminal. Ultimately, it's, can I take something away from you that you need, and that you need enough that you're willing to pay me to have it back? And the truth is that every minute that goes by when a business can't operate is a financial loss. Let's forget about the ransom amounts for a second. If a business cannot do business, that's money that's being lost. That's a lot harder to visualize. That's worker hours that are being lost. That's products that are not shipping. Eventually, you might be able to calculate that, but in the moment, it's much harder. But ultimately, those losses stack up oftentimes to more than the actual ransom we've seen. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a Fortune 500 company or a small t-shirt printing shop. This is true everywhere. So how do you go forward? Choosing the right pen test is paramount here. So when we talk about kinds of penetration tests that are worth conducting in an environment, the complicated, longer answer to this is it should be based on your threat model. Remember at the beginning we talked about things you should have. You should have an asset inventory because you need to know what you have. You should have a network diagram because you need to know how all of those things are interacting. And you should have a threat model, which is something that informs your understanding of how someone might want to get at those assets or what those assets hold. In a business world, we have to communicate those a little more simply. So in Renegade Labs, we do many types of penetration testing, but there are some core penetration test types that we do most often. I'm going to go through those in the next slide. So the first one is network penetration testing. This is probably something that most of you are familiar with. It is the most common. It can be external, it can be internal, it all depends. A lot of times we see external penetration tests, which include port scanning and vulnerability scanning of an outer network perimeter. But where we find the most value, in line with a lot of what I've talked about in this presentation, is actually starting from the inside, assuming that a breach is going to happen, because it is, and understanding what an attacker can do next once they've gotten a foothold on the environment. That's where we see the most value with network penetration testing. The next most common type of penetration testing we do is web penetration testing. So I used a few examples of SaaS applications when I was talking about how businesses might understand their own threat model. So web pen tests honestly vary in complexity. So we've dealt with some legacy applications. We deal with a lot of more dynamic or modern web applications. The way we usually test these is from an authenticated perspective. So there's not a lot of functionality that can be seen from the outside. In some cases there is, but most web apps, a lot of the functionality is locked behind a login page. So we start with a user account or a user account and an admin account, and we will try and understand where if somebody already had an account in a SaaS application or a web platform, what they could do from there. Because again, that is where an attack is most likely to start from. It's not most likely to start from the outside. It can happen in the case that there's a 0-day published about a web server version or maybe an application stack component. But most of the time it's going to happen from either a compromised account or a legitimate user trying to do something malicious. Third is mobile app penetration testing. So there's a lot of overlap between mobile apps and web apps. Most commonly, the mobile app is just a representative form of a web app. We find that they often use the same APIs, they'll use the same backend servers and services. Where things get different is how that application has to change based on the mobile platform it's sitting on, iOS or Android. And then what security mechanisms might not exist in a mobile app that would exist in the actual web app if it was being viewed through a browser. And then we do cloud penetration testing. So this one is much less well known, but cloud penetration testing in some ways is a lot like network pen testing, because ultimately the most basic way to use a cloud platform like AWS or Azure is to just create servers that host data, They host applications just like you would in a data center. In fact, all of these really are just in data centers, but there is an overlay system on top of these servers that consist of services. So talking about AWS, there's file storage that's called S3, and there are servers, virtual servers, that are called EC2 instances. These two can interact because of AWS, and they interact quite well, but ultimately, it's still file storage and virtual servers. So there are ways to test cloud platforms, just treating them like traditional networks. However, the most impactful way to test these is actually to start similarly from an assumed breach perspective. So one of the most common questions that I will ask when talking about cloud penetration testing is, what kind of access does a regular user of your cloud environment have? So if we were talking about a SaaS application that sits on AWS and there's a team of 15 developers, I want to know what kind of access those developers have. So if they have AWS keys and they can authenticate through the command line or the web panel and access a set of functions, I want to know what would happen if I got a hold of their keys. Because again, malware landing anywhere, either through phishing or some other means, is a bad thing. And if I, as an attacker, am able to get malware on a developer machine, I can use their keys. And if I can use their keys, I can access the cloud environment. And what happens after that is something that, if you haven't evaluated, you might not be prepared for. So we'll start from an assumed breach perspective, and then we can actually assess how you're using the services, whether it's GCP, Azure, or AWS. How are you using the core products within those platforms? How are they integrated with accounts, with servers that you're using? If it's Azure, maybe you've also linked it up to an on-prem Active Directory deployment. How are those talking to each other? Are there any weaknesses in that configuration inherently that an attacker could take control of? Those are the kinds of things that we look at. So these are 4 really common types of penetration testing. These are the kinds of things that you can Google and find out about. But in a perfect world, we wouldn't just silo out products like this. To get to a certain point of security maturity, you have to be able to look at an organization from a threat perspective and understand, okay, we have a SaaS application, so we should probably get a web pen test for that, but it sits on AWS. So do we also need a cloud penetration test? Probably. All our people are remote, but they have home networks. This is where it gets complicated. And this is where you have to sort of break the mold on these classically named products and actually come up with an engagement that fits your organization, that speaks to your unique security situation. And because of that, it can provide the most value. The pen test results can be most useful. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Corey, I don't know if any came in. I expect some did, but I'd love to answer them.
Yeah, so guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to fill it out. Also in the handout section, we included the ebook that this presentation is based on. So if you want to download that, you can. So yeah, Brian, we actually have 3 questions to start with.
Okay.
Take a look. Okay, so how would I start with a cloud pen test? Do you need network access, or do you do it from the outside?
So honestly, both. And like I just mentioned, the credentialed access, understanding where a breach would probably start and assessing from that point, that's what I would do first. If it came down to getting as much done as possible quickly, then looking at the cloud environment from the outside, using IP ranges or domain names, that's a great place to start. It is important to understand how classic vulnerabilities might exist in the environment. So if you're using virtual servers and maybe they haven't been updated in a while, then you can look at those servers just like you would in a regular network, running a vulnerability scanner, something like that. But ultimately, where a lot of the value is going to come from is looking at the cloud environment from cloud authentication, having a key pair, having a login. That's the best place to start.
Okay, so the next question is, I do regular vulnerability scans. Are these good enough?
So So good enough, good enough is difficult because in reality, really nothing you do is ever going to be, quote, good enough. This is a constant process because threats are constantly evolving. And what that is forcing is for organizations to constantly evolve. We have to keep up, otherwise life can get very difficult. So vulnerability scanning, I would say, is an important practical exercise when it comes to having a vulnerability management program. It is great at identifying low-hanging fruit, but considering how many things we find in environments that don't show up in vulnerability scans, I would say that it's only part of the process, and that sticking to just vulnerability scans is probably going to hurt in the long run.
Okay. We have another question. Do you guys have any additional content out there on the subject matter?
We do, yeah. So shameless plug, I did a webinar just a little bit ago, I think a month and a half, 2 months ago, on how to actually recognize good penetration testing. So if you already do penetration testing or you're shopping the market, I talked about some of the things that I have identified and things that we try to do to make our penetration tests the best in the market. We also have blogs and white papers on types of penetration testing that go into a little bit more detail than I've talked about in this webinar, but that's all available on our website.
All right, another question here. You mentioned you guys have a tool that you got a lot of this data from. How can we get access to it?
Yeah, so that's Phalanx. That's our GRC platform. The good news is that generally speaking, it's free. There are a lot of features to it that are in paid tiers, but we do have a free tier of Phalanx, so you can go sign up for it honestly right now, and that will end up with our customer success people, and they will let you in if if your application goes through, and you can start using it today. You can run assessments through it. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do with it that help you manage a security program, and that's where we've been able to gather a lot of this data because we use it internally. It's not just a product that we sell. When we're doing internal audits, when we're doing compliance work, we are ourselves using Phalanx with our clients. And so we're able to gather those kinds of metadata type trends about what kinds of gaps we find most often. So whether it's SOC 2 or the 27001 framework or PCI DSS, there's a lot of commonality between those. And so we can identify that endpoint hardening across X number of clients is just missing, or there's a gap there. And we can aggregate all of that and really identify what the most common security problems are.
So we have one last question. Why do I need to do this if I'm doing phishing training with my staff?
So I'll go back to the assumed breach idea. So phishing is certainly one way, if not the most common way, for breaches to begin. That's how attackers most often get into environments at the start. The problem is it's not the only way. And even if you're doing phishing training, there's no way to account for whether a unique type of phishing or a very clever phishing attempt is going to get through. So doing phishing training about some of the more common stuff like gift card offers or headlines, that sort of thing, that's really good. That gets people used to spotting phishing emails, but it only takes one. And if phishing training is all you're doing and you're not doing anything else, then the phishing training only has to be not good enough one time. And then all bets are off after that.
Cool. Well, Ryan, that's the last question that we have. Thank you all for attending today. And great job, Ryan, as always, on the content.
Great. Thanks, everyone.